When you start talking about the kings and queens of England, it can get very muddling, and when you throw the Scottish monarchs into the fray as well, for good measure, matters tend to get even more complicated. It also doesn't help that many of the erstwhile sovereigns share names, with a number being the only distinction between them. The confusion is never greater than in the case of Mary Queen of Scots, the subject of our film, a woman who truly was years ahead of her time. So before we begin telling the remarkable story of Mary Queen of Scots, we'll set the scene with a real fast and sometimes furious race through the history of the kings and queens of England, Scotland, and even France. Mary's Stuart parents were King James V of Scotland and his French wife Marie de Guise. At this time, neighbouring England was ruled by King Henry VIII, who was a Tudor. Now, Henry VIII was best known for his 6 wives: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. And if you want to remember what happened to them, there's a little rhyme which goes: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. As a result of all this marital disharmony, Henry was excommunicated by the Pope, and England broke away from the Catholic faith to become a Protestant nation. Despite his many wives, Henry VIII struggled to produce a male heir, and his only legitimate son, Edward VI, ruled for a very short time. And then the trouble really started. Mary, Henry's daughter from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, succeeded to the throne in the absence of any suitable males. Brought up as a devout Catholic, Mary restored England's links with Rome, and her vicious persecution of Protestants resulted in her earning the title Bloody Mary. However, she didn't last long either, and was succeeded by Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I, who also happened to be the cousin of Mary Queen of Scots. As Henry had broken with Rome to marry Elizabeth's mother, the new queen was a Protestant, and when she came to power, she restored the Protestant Church of England. These were dangerous times, and many people lost their lives simply for being of the wrong faith during the reigns of these 2 half-sisters. Te lucis ante terminum, rerum creator pascimus, ut solita. As complicated as all this sounds, it really will help, because after the death of James V of Scotland, our Mary was crowned Queen of Scotland when she was just 9 months old. Later, as the story develops, we end up with Elizabeth I as a Protestant on the throne of England, and her cousin Mary as a devout Catholic on the throne of Scotland. This would dominate the lives of both women and ultimately result in tragedy for one of them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves in our search to find the woman behind the legend that is Mary Queen of Scots. Regnat cum Sancto Spiritu. Amen. There is a delightful old nursery rhyme that children still say to this day all over Great Britain, and many people believe it's about Mary Queen of Scots, suggesting that down through the ages her story has been a source of immense fascination. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells, and pretty maids all in a row. The first line, Mary, Mary, quite contrary, is a reference to the fact that she was a ruling queen rather than a king, because she shouldn't have been ruling at all, according to a 14th century law that decreed the Scottish crown should only be inherited by men, unless the male line had become extinct. Which is precisely what happened when King James V died, something he realised just before his tragic end when Mary was born. Woe is me, my dynasty came with a lass, it will pass with a lass. A lass is actually a Scottish term for a girl or woman, and in point of fact, the Stuart dynasty he was speaking of began with the daughter of that much better known Scottish king, Robert the Bruce. The how does your garden grow part of the rhyme refers to Mary ruling over the vast landscape of Scotland with its magnificent rolling hills and windswept, rain-soaked valleys that have inspired so many poets, artists and writers. With silver bells and cockle shells refers to the fact that she was a devout Roman Catholic. Silver bells are used in Catholic services, and the cockleshell is the symbol used for the shrine of St. James, significant to those of the Catholic faith. The pretty maids all in a row are thought to be a reference to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, as a maid was an early device that predated the French guillotine, used for severing heads. However, it's more likely that this line actually refers to her 4 closest friends, all called Mary, the daughters of Scottish nobility, who were her constant companions. But then again, you were warned that things could get very confusing, as many people believe that this rhyme is about Queen Mary of England, Elizabeth I's older sister, with a much more unpleasant translation that we definitely won't elaborate on. So you can see for yourself how Mary Stuart of Scotland and Mary Tudor of England can be easily muddled. So let's put the record straight. Mary Stuart, the future Queen of the Scots, was born on the 8th of December 1542 at Linlithgow Palace, 15 miles to the west of Scotland's capital, Edinburgh. This majestic palace was an important landmark for the Stuart dynasty, and Mary returned to the palace many times during her reign. The palace itself is something of a hollow shell today, having been damaged by fire in 1746, but restored and renovated by Historic Scotland. However, the grand towering walls of the outer and inner circle, along with a number of the once grand apartments, remain standing, almost perfectly intact, making Linlithgow an impressive place to visit on any Scottish tour. In fact, many weddings are celebrated here today in these truly magnificent surroundings. But there was little joy at Mary's birth back in 1542, as a month before her arrival, her father, King James V, had been defeated by the English in a disastrous battle at Solway Moss that left him broken and depressed. Now, with royal dynasties all being connected, it won't come as any surprise that James V of Scotland was the nephew of Henry VIII of England, and he bitterly opposed his uncle's break from the Catholic faith, and he refused to even speak to Henry. This infuriated the King of England, and he began sending legions of troops to reclaim Scotland and take away Scottish independence as a punishment. The biggest of the battles took place at Solway Moss, a large marshy peat bog just to the south of the Scottish borders in the English county of Cumbria, which resulted in up to 20,000 Scottish soldiers being overpowered by a much smaller English army of as little as 3,000 men. This was a truly humiliating defeat for the King of Scotland, who hadn't been present at the battle because he'd been forced to retreat to Falkland Palace with a high fever that had developed from a common cold. Falkland Palace was the pride and joy of King James V, who had added extensively to this royal residence, transforming it into a sophisticated Renaissance palace of real beauty. It was James who was responsible for adding such luxuries as a royal tennis court to Falkland Palace, which still survives to this day. However, he had little opportunity to enjoy his handiwork, as just 2 weeks after the Battle of Solway Moss, the young king, barely 30 years old, died as a result of the complications from his head cold on December the 14th, 1542. His daughter Mary was just 7 days old. This was the second time that the unfortunate Marie de Guise had been widowed in the space of 8 years. Her first marriage had been to the Duke of Longueville in the Palace of the Louvre in Paris, and ironically the couple had travelled to Scotland to attend the wedding of King James V and Princess Madeleine of France. Within a few weeks of marrying, Princess Madeleine, who was suffering from tuberculosis, succumbed to the cold and wet Scottish climate and died. Then, a few years later, Marie's husband, the Duke, also died, and James V of Scotland, who needed an alliance with France against his uncle, King Henry VIII, asked for her hand. It's interesting to note that Henry had also shown an interest in the 21-year-old widowed Marie, as he himself was between wives, and she had given the Duke 2 healthy sons, and Henry craved a male heir above all things. Marie chose the Scottish throne and was crowned Queen of Scotland at Edinburgh Castle in 1540. She was an instant success with her adopted people, as the first thing she did was to learn the language, and then she promptly produced an heir to the Scottish throne called James. However, King James, the baby's father, was becoming increasingly prone to paranoid bouts of depression believing that the nobility of Scotland were plotting with England against him. He even executed a number of his closest friends with no evidence whatsoever. Marie then gave birth to a second son, Robert, in 1541, but within days of the christening, both he and his elder brother James were dead. The circumstances were suspicious, to say the least, and it's alleged that the family of one of the nobles the king had executed was responsible for poisoning the little boys. If you travel to Edinburgh and visit the magnificent Holyrood Palace, the two princes were buried in the peaceful surroundings of Holyrood Abbey. Although the abbey is now little more than a ruin due to an 18th century roof collapse, the building still has a majestic quality next to the imposing palace that is to this day the official Scottish residence of the reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. If Holyrood sounds a strange word, rood is an old Scottish term for a cross, so the palace and the abbey literally translate as Holy Cross. Traumatic as all this must have been for the King and Queen, the state of the Scottish nation was also deeply disturbed. Scheming and plotting was going on everywhere, and due to malicious rumours, James and Marie grew further and further apart. She was accused of adulterous affairs, and he took up with a string of mistresses, fathering a number of illegitimate offspring. Somehow, amidst all this turmoil, Marie became pregnant again, this time with a girl, the Mary of our story, and as we already know, within days of the birth, her father, James V, King of Scotland, died, leaving the tiny baby girl as the only rightful heir to the Scottish throne. After what had happened to her little boys, Queen Marie was justifiably afraid for her daughter and faced a tough decision: either return to France and relative safety or stay in Scotland as Queen Regent. To leave Scotland would have meant leaving baby Mary behind, which was unthinkable. So Queen Marie decided to stay and do everything possible to stabilise the situation. The little girl was just 9 months old when she was crowned Mary Queen of Scots in the Chapel Royal at Stirling Castle on December the 9th, 1543. This unique ceremony saw Mary dressed in heavy regal robes that had been specially created in miniature. She even had a train of ermine, a jewelled satin gown, huge long sleeves, and a velvet mantle. She was sat in the throne of Scotland, but had to be held upright by the presiding Lord Chancellor. Now, while all this was going on, King Henry VIII still had his eye on Scotland, and he decided that Mary Queen of Scots should be married to his son Edward to unite England and Scotland as one nation. To achieve this, he set out to dominate Scotland, and this was known as the Rough Wooing, and indeed it was. Queen Marie, the child's mother, was forbidden to leave Stirling Castle, a huge fortress perched on a hilltop with high cliffs to three sides, leaving her unable to contact her family in France for help. Then King Henry VIII died suddenly in January 1547, and he was succeeded by little Mary's child fiancé Edward. The English throne was controlled by the Earl of Hertford, as Edward wasn't of age, and he swiftly invaded Scotland to claim it as part of England. To cement this alliance, Hertford was determined to force through the marriage that Henry VIII had arranged between the child monarchs. However, he hadn't counted on the determination of Mary's mother, who begged for help from France. Assistance came in the form of a marriage proposal from the King of France, no less, requesting Mary's hand for his newborn son, the Dauphin Francois. The Dauphin was the term used for the heir to the French throne, while if he had a wife, she was known as the Dauphine. Queen Marie agreed, and with the blessing of the Scottish Parliament, sent her daughter to the French court. By all accounts, Mary was a delightful child, graceful, pretty, and intelligent. The French people took her to their hearts, and the king himself, no less, described her as the most perfect child he'd ever seen. Mary's travelling companions were the four Marys: Mary Fleming, Mary Seton, Mary Beaton, and Mary Livingstone, all of whom were the daughters of Scottish noblemen. They would remain with their namesake for her whole life, right through from her marriage to the Dauphin to her arrest, imprisonment, and eventual execution some 40 years later. According to sources close to the royal family, when the Dauphin met Mary for the first time, they were immediately friendly and affectionate towards each other. He was 4 years old, whilst Mary was a year older. These were peaceful years in France after the turmoil of the Scottish court, and Mary was educated in the traditional manner of a French princess. She was taught how to speak French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and Greek. She learned to sing and dance, and also how to play musical instruments. Mary was tutored in religious matters by a Scottish priest, and in 1558 she married the Dauphin of France in Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris. In all, Mary enjoyed 13 good years in France, and her marriage was evidently happy. But as we all know, 13 is considered unlucky, and in the case of the young Queen of France and Scotland, the fates were most definitely set against her. Within the space of a year, her mother, who had been keeping the peace in Scotland, died, and even more tragically, so did Mary's husband, shortly after being crowned King of France. There was no other option for the 18-year-old widow. Mary was Queen of Scotland, and she needed to take control of her birthright. Her destination was Edinburgh, and she arrived at the great city's port of Leith. In honour of her French heritage, Mary Stuart changed the spelling of her surname from the Scottish way, Stewart, to the French version, Stuart. And this is why you will find two spellings of the Stuart name in the history books, before and after Mary's arrival in Scotland in 1561. Without her husband or her mother, Mary may well have considered looking to England for comfort, where her cousin Elizabeth had been queen since 1558. However, Elizabeth had already developed a deep distrust of Mary through circumstances beyond the Scottish Queen's control. When Elizabeth was crowned, the Catholics believed she had no right to rule and urged Mary to step forward as the only legitimate and Catholic heir to the throne of England. It was the start of a troubled relationship between the two women that would without doubt damage them both. So Mary followed her own course, taking her rightful place as Queen of Scotland, vowing that she would continue in her mother's footsteps and keep the peace between the feuding Scottish noble lords. Also, religious differences were causing all sorts of problems in Scotland as well. Just a year before Mary's arrival, the Scottish Reformation, led by the fiery preacher John Knox, declared Scotland Protestant. As Mary herself was a devout Catholic, she advocated a policy of religious tolerance, but John Knox was not inclined to return the favour. In general, Queen Mary seemed to be getting by with little need for strong-arm tactics, while her gentle approach and charming French manners helped the people warm to her, with one notable exception. Yes, you've guessed right, John Knox. At the time of Queen Mary's return, he was Edinburgh's most powerful minister, based at the city's magnificent St Giles Cathedral, an awe-inspiring Gothic edifice from where he used to rant and rave in his sermons about the frivolity and heresy of the Scottish Queen. Remember, she was young, attractive, and used to being flattered and adored, but the pious clergyman was having none of it. Knox published pamphlets like the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, in which he attacked and urged against a female monarch, writing that female rulers were most odious in the presence of God and were undeniably traitors and rebels against the Almighty. John Knox certainly proved to be a thorn in Mary's flesh, and to this day you can still visit his imposing house, now a museum on Edinburgh's Royal Mile, not far from where he presided over the pulpit in St Giles Cathedral. Incidentally, the Royal Mile is the name of the road that joins the magnificent fortress that is Edinburgh Castle with the grandeur of Holyrood Palace, and Mary Queen of Scots would come to know both of these royal houses very well indeed, in the first instance making her home at Holyrood. In fact, it was in this very palace that Mary, quite suddenly, and some would say inexplicably, married her first cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. At first, the people of Scotland were shocked by their queen's rash behaviour, but Mary knew they would quickly get used to the idea, especially if she could produce a son and heir for the nation. Despite her efforts since arriving, the Scottish lords had continually battled against each other, but a Stuart prince would keep the Scottish crown safe, whatever happened. In retrospect, it's hard to imagine why Mary chose to marry Darnley, an immature, unpopular 19-year-old who was known to have a particularly unpleasant, violent streak. But perhaps she simply made the best of a bad lot. At least Darnley had royal blood and could be controlled, or so Mary might have thought, as he was only crowned king consort, which essentially meant he had the title of king, but none of the powers. Darnley was, needless to say, eager to make such an advantageous match, hoping to eventually rule England as well as Scotland, as it was likely that if Elizabeth I did not marry and have children of her own, Mary would by default become the English Queen's heir. But Mary was disappointed with her choice very early in the marriage. No doubt Darnley was charming while he was wooing her, but after the marriage vows had been exchanged, it was a different story. Spoiled, petulant and given to mood swings, Darnley became a pawn for the Scottish nobles, who were just waiting for an opportunity to remove Mary from power. Matters deteriorated further, ironically, when Mary did become pregnant, as Darnley perhaps realised that a son would become king of a unified Scotland and England rather than him. A tragic turn of events occurred at Holyrood when Mary was forced to witness the brutal murder of her private secretary and great friend, David Rizzio. The Queen was 5 months pregnant at the time, and one school of thought is that Darnley, who was involved in the horrific killing, was hoping to cause his wife to miscarry. However, others believe that Rizzio was Mary's lover, and the child she was carrying was in fact his rather than Darnley's, making revenge the motive rather than anything more sinister. If Mary had thought her life troubled before, she now found herself pregnant with a violent husband begging her forgiveness and coping with the loss of her dearest friend at the Scottish court. As Queen, she granted Darnley a pardon, but their relationship had been destroyed. John Knox, the Protestant preacher who'd spent the 7 years of Mary's reign verbally attacking her at every opportunity from the pulpit of St Giles Cathedral, openly praised the murder of David Rizzio. Knox believed the worst of Mary, and with public opinion split, as well as her husband's treachery, she knew she would have to take steps to protect her unborn child. With great care, she managed to smuggle a message out of the palace to a loyal Scottish lord called James Hepburn, Duke of Orkney and the 4th Earl of Bothwell, who took the distraught Queen to Edinburgh Castle and comparative safety. 3 months and 10 days later, on the 19th of June 1566, Mary's son James was born after a long and painful labour, the rightful heir to the Scottish throne. He was baptised a Catholic in the chapel of Stirling Castle, a short distance from Edinburgh, much to the disgust of both the preacher John Knox and Elizabeth I. At 23 years of age, Mary had provided Scotland with a rightful heir to the Stuart dynasty. She now held power over the feuding Scottish lords because of her son. But in personal terms, her own life lay in ruins. Mary turned to Bothwell, who had protected her in the past, as a valued personal advisor, as Darnley became sidelined and despised by the Scottish nobles who now supported Mary. In fear of his own life, Darnley, ever the coward, decided to escape to France. He got as far as the city of Glasgow, still in Scotland, and had to rest there because of illness. Medical reports at the time suggest that this may have been syphilis, contracted before he married Mary. The fact that he didn't pass this disease on to his wife is often cited as another indication that Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, was not his son. Nevertheless, Mary did her duty as a wife and attended her husband on his sickbed in Glasgow, allowing him to rest and recover before returning with him to Edinburgh Castle, and surprisingly, reconciliation was even considered. Then Darnley decided at the last minute to stay elsewhere, rather than risk infecting his son. The house was at Kirkerfield, not far from Edinburgh, but Mary chose not to remain with him. On February the 13th, 1563, definitely unlucky for Darnley, a huge explosion tore through the house and was even felt on the streets of Edinburgh. Gunpowder had filled the chamber below Darnley's rooms, and the finger of suspicion immediately pointed in Bothwell's direction. Ironically, when Darnley's body was found, the only marks upon it were of strangulation, and it's believed he realised what was happening and tried to escape. The fact that he'd been strangled implied he was prevented from doing this, and the plot curiously thickens. Now, it doesn't take much detective work to add 2 and 2 together to get 5. Did Mary really attempt reconciliation with Darnley, or was she, under Bothwell's instruction, luring him into a trap? It was all too coincidental for the canny Scots, who became very suspicious of the Queen's part in the murder, and more importantly, Bothwell's influence over her. What happened next in this strange saga relies a great deal on conjecture, as Mary went to visit her son James at Stirling Castle. It will be the last meeting of mother and child, as the series of events that followed sealed Mary's tragic fate. On her return from Stirling to Edinburgh, Mary was kidnapped by Bothwell, although some accounts suggest that she was a more than willing captive. The next thing that the people of Scotland knew was that in the May of 1567, Queen Mary married the Earl of Bothwell at the Palace of Holyrood. They were not best pleased, and John Knox demanded the pair be brought to justice for Darnley's murder. A mere month into the royal marriage, the Scottish lords decided that Bothwell was a dangerous man to hold so much power, and was a considerably worse prospect as the Queen's husband than even Darnley had been. The battle lines were quickly drawn, and Mary realised that her marriage had compromised her position. So in order to avoid bloodshed, when an army of rebel nobles and their forces met her own troops at Carberry Hill, 8 miles southeast of Edinburgh, she handed herself over to them as a prisoner. Mary Queen of Scots was then taken to yet another Scottish castle, this time Loch Leven, a small square fortress on an island in the middle of a loch, strategically placed between the towns of Edinburgh, Stirling and Perth. Today this is a truly beautiful place, cared for by Historic Scotland, and it's hard to imagine a more romantic location. But for Mary there would be little to cheer her within its walls, as Loch Leven was just another in a series of castle prisons in which she would spend the rest of her days. However, in the 16th century, Loch Leven Castle was much bigger than its ruins would suggest, and it certainly had a distinguished list of previous occupants. William Wallace, the famous Scottish rebel, better known since Mel Gibson's movie as Braveheart, stormed the castle to win it back from the English, who had violated Scotland and her people so brutally. However, getting back to Mary Queen of Scots' enforced stay at Loch Leven, there is another great mystery that surrounds this unfortunate young woman. Whilst a captive in the care of the castle's owner, Sir William Douglas, she is believed to have given birth to twins, fathered by either Darnley or Bothwell. Many believe that the infants were stillborn, while others romanticise about them being smuggled off the island and whisked away to the safety of France, as people search for some kind of happy ending to this tragic tale. On the 24th of July 1567, in a weakened state from the difficult birth of the mysterious twins, Mary was forced to sign abdication papers sent by the Scottish lords to give up her claim to the Scottish throne, allowing her 1-year-old son James to be crowned in her place as King James VI of Scotland. Left in peace after her acquiescence, Mary's health began to improve, and she immediately started to plot her escape from Loch Leven Castle. First, she sent pleading letters of help to her cousin Queen Elizabeth in England, who totally ignored Mary's plight. With no other option available, Mary escaped her castle prison on May 2nd, 1568, with the help of the youngest son of Sir William Douglas, who smuggled Mary, dressed as a servant girl, across the loch in a rowing boat to a group of waiting Scottish lords who were sympathetic to the Stuart cause. Together they raised an army of 600 men, but was soon defeated when they went into battle. Mary then made the unprecedented decision to journey south to England in order to ask for the support of Queen Elizabeth I, who had avoided many of the difficulties that Mary had faced by never marrying. Unfortunately, help was once again not forthcoming. Queen Elizabeth had a number of options she could legitimately take, one being to send Mary back to the Scottish nobles, which would have been a cruel fate for a woman who in reality had done her no harm. Alternatively, she could exile the Scottish Queen to France, which would probably have been the kindest option for Mary, but could well have compromised Elizabeth's position. Mary would have been a powerful pawn in the hands of the French king to use against the English throne. Then again, Elizabeth could forcibly restore Mary to her position as Queen of Scotland, but that would cause conflict between the two nations all over again. Eventually, she chose to imprison Mary in England, although this was dangerous because the Catholic Queen would be perceived by Elizabeth's enemies as a figurehead for any plots to overthrow the Protestant pretender. To avoid this happening, Elizabeth kept moving Mary from castle to castle as her political prisoner. Catholic plots grew thick and fast, and always Mary's name was attached to them somewhere in the background. Elizabeth's paranoia increased as the years passed by, and Mary lived out her days with only a handful of loyal companions by her side, and she would probably have known nothing of the plots bearing her name. Eventually, Elizabeth bowed to the pressure of her advisers, who wanted the threat posed by Mary eliminated, and the Queen of Scots was put on trial for the murder of Darnley. This trial took place without Mary present, so she was unable to defend herself, and revolved around a series of letters and documents written to Bothwell before they were married. These love letters and poems were the only evidence against her, and they were probably forgeries created to imply Mary was an unfit mother and adulteress. They were called the casket letters, as they had been kept in a silver casket, and even by 16th century legal standards could not have proved Mary guilty of anything. However, the court delivered a guilty verdict, and everyone waited to see what Elizabeth would do next. The Queen of England did nothing, and Mary continued her existence within the walls of her castle prisons. Bothwell had fled Scotland and sought refuge in Denmark, where eventually his life of drink and debauchery caught up with him. An angry father, whose daughter had been taken advantage of by Bothwell, locked him up in a Copenhagen castle, chained to a dungeon wall with a low roof that didn't allow him to stand up straight. Then the King of Denmark thought a ransom could be extracted for the Scottish nobleman, but nobody wanted to pay. After all his scheming and plotting, Bothwell died insane and alone in a strange land, his dreams of ruling Scotland and England never fulfilled. Elizabeth I was a difficult woman to manipulate, and those who thought Mary's trial over the casket letters would result in the Queen of Scots' execution were disappointed. The Queen of England stubbornly continued her policy of moving Mary from castle to castle for 19 long years, in which time her son, James VI of Scotland, had reached his 15th birthday and assumed the throne of Scotland outright. He had been raised a Protestant by his kidnappers, and because of this did nothing to help his mother, imprisoned in England. In fact, he had no communication with her whatsoever. Catholic sympathisers came and went. Plots on the Protestant Queen's life were foiled, but Elizabeth never let Mary stand trial again for another 18 years. However, the persecution of Catholics increased, and a visit to Harvington Hall, a fine house of the period that belonged to a family that secretly kept faith with Rome, illustrates just how serious a business this really was. In almost every room are concealed priest holes where the men who travelled the country to say Mass with the faithful could be hidden. The penalty for this act of worship was death for the Catholic priest and the household, and the priest holes saved many lives. But it was an issue that continued to threaten Elizabeth's position on a personal and political level, and eventually a law was passed that deemed any Catholic plot against the Queen of England, regardless of whether it was instigated by Mary or not, would result in the Queen of Scots being tried for treason. Sir Francis Walsingham, England's Secretary of State, was responsible for Elizabeth's safety, and he was certainly keen to remove the problem of Mary Queen of Scots once and for all. A plan was hatched and cleverly executed that has gone down in history as the Babington plot, consisting of secret letters between Mary and Sir Anthony Babington. Walsingham had the letters added to with a forged postscript, and Mary's fate was sealed. She was implicated in a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth. Mary Queen of Scots was moved to Fotheringay Castle in September 1586 to stand trial for treason. Despite strenuously denying the accusation with a spirited defence, she was found guilty. One of her more memorable comments during her trial was, "Remember, gentlemen, the theatre of history is wider than the realm of England." Fotheringay Castle stood in Northamptonshire, about 12 miles west of Peterborough, and there is little left to see today apart from a few stones and a grass-covered mound. But for Mary, it was yet another castle prison. However, this time, unbeknown to her, it was to be her last. She wasn't told the outcome of her trial, and it was months later, on the 7th of February 1587, that Mary learned she was to be executed the next day. Rumour has it that Queen Elizabeth still hadn't wanted to see her cousin beheaded, and only signed the death warrant in error, believing the document to be something else. But whatever the truth, Walsingham and his supporters had what they'd wanted for a very long time, and on this occasion there was no reprieve for the ill-fated Queen of Scotland. Mary entered the Great Hall of Fotheringay Castle on the 8th of February 1587, knowing that unlike the 200 or more spectators, she would never leave again. She wore black satin and velvet, but as she reached the block, the outer garments were cast off to reveal a dress of red, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. It's reported that it took 4 attempts for the executioner to fulfil his task, and after the first blow failed, Mary is said to have cried out, "Sweet Jesus." This must have been a horrific enough spectacle, but worse was to come as the Scottish Queen's headless body began to move. Mary's faithful pet dog, a little terrier called Skye, had been hiding under the red skirt and had been present throughout the entire brutal affair. However, the suffering was at last at an end, and although Mary would have undoubtedly preferred a swifter departure from this world, her prayer on the day of her death suggests that the 20 years she had spent in captivity, never knowing which day was to be her last, had taken its toll. O my Lord and my God, I have trusted in thee. O my dear Jesus, now liberate me. In shackle and chain, in torture and pain, I long for thee. In weakness and sighing, kneeling and crying, I adore and implore thee to liberate me. This was a poignant end for the once light-hearted, fun-loving, elegant, witty, tolerant and beautiful Mary Queen of Scots, who had spent her whole life being a political pawn by virtue of her birth. Some would say it was her terrible choice in men that was her downfall, others that her pretty face had been the real reason for her cousin Queen Elizabeth turning against her. But this is indeed always going to be a story open to speculation. However, the one thing that we do know for sure is that out of this turmoil, James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, united the two nations when he was crowned James I of England after Queen Elizabeth's death in 1603. It's highly probable, if contemporary records are to be believed, that King James I wasn't a particularly nice man to know, but all agree that he was a remarkable monarch, writing a new page in the history books, ruling over the first United Kingdom. Eventually, it took until 1612, James moved the body of his mother, Mary, from a simple tomb in Peterborough Cathedral, close to Fotheringay, to a magnificent tomb in Westminster Abbey, as befitted the once Queen of Scotland and France. Ironically, the three most powerful women of the Tudor and Stuart dynasties lie in state very close to each other in Westminster Abbey. Queen Mary I of England, better known to us now as Bloody Mary, is buried with her sister Queen Elizabeth I, and the Latin inscription translates as, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." An appropriate postscript would be, and cousin Mary too, because the tomb of Mary Queen of Scots lies just about 9 metres away, but few who pass here will ever appreciate the irony. Whatever their struggle in life, monarchy, religion, and in Mary Queen of Scots' case, men, these three women, who had more in common than they ever got the opportunity to realise, in a different set of circumstances, might well have been the greatest of friends.